Welcome to my program, Bashy's Corner. We discuss issues in the Danish society which normally mainstream media doesn't want or don't care. And to prove my point, when my guest today will appear, then you will see why I said what I said. Denmark is a beautiful country, high living standards, very peaceful atmosphere, well-functioning society. And these are the hallmarks of this second home I made in many years back. Unfortunately, this calm exterior hides some very ugly realities, and that is about discrimination, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, which are on the rise. Many native Danes actually say that there is no racism, there is no discrimination, there is no Islamophobia. It is also figment of minorities' imagination. And some go as far as to blame minorities for the situation they are in. Luckily, there are some academics and intellectuals who don't share this kind of populist discourse. They have worked to prove that the situation is getting worse. And one of the person who has done a lot of research in many years and whom I have been very lucky and my honor to work with is Mira. Mira is PhD fellow, teaching assistant professor at Aalborg University. Mira, thank you very much for coming. I am really honored and pleased that you said yes after a long request to come to my program. Your name, Mira Skadegaard Thorsen, is very Danish, right? But I also know that behind this Danish name there is another beautiful background. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, it's I was born in Denmark. My father is Danish, and my mother is from India. But I actually never lived for a very long period in either of those countries. I basically grew up in the United States. Oh. I was born here, lived here for a few years, and then because of my father's work, he was moved around with his work, and we followed. So we ended up in the States. We were supposed to be there for 2 years, and we were there for a lot longer.
So your dad was a diplomat? Or
no, he was working, at the time he was working for Oticon, which is a Danish hearing aid company, okay. And we actually went to the States because there were race riots in the States at the time, and as I understand it, the story is that the people that were in Oticon at the time didn't want to stay. They were frightened about it, and so they apparently my father said yes, and so we ended up in the States for 2 years, and that became 20-some years.
But you never lived in India?
Not for a long extent. I've been there for months at a time. I was there for an extended period in my high school years, and then I was in India every other summer, sometimes every summer, to visit family. With my family, so it was a holiday space, and I had, of course, family.
So when you go to India from Denmark, do you feel that somehow inside that this is also your roots?
When I go to India?
Yeah.
I do feel that I have roots in India. I have roots in India, so there's no question. In the same way, I also have roots in Denmark.
Of course.
And I feel I'm very rooted in the States. So I have a multi-identity, and I'm perfectly comfortable with
that. Very cosmopolitan person.
I guess you could call it that. We'll call it that.
Yes, yeah. As long as I have known you, you have been involved in human rights, working with anti-discrimination, ethnic equality. Why such an interest?
That is a difficult question to answer. I think I've always been very interested in social justice ever since I can remember. But I think it really hit home for me when I moved to Denmark in my early 20s, because I had grown up in a very, very privileged context. My background was, of course I knew I was a person of color to a certain degree, but it was never something where I was minoritized by this fact. It was just a fact. So in my background, being mixed in the way that I'm mixed was actually just an okay thing, a normal thing. It was never an issue. When I moved to Denmark, I slowly came to realize how much of a problem it was to be of color in Denmark, and how difficult it is to belong as a person of color in a Danish context. I'd never experienced direct racism or direct discrimination as far as I can remember before I moved here. And that made me decide with time that I needed to change my own knowledge, improve my knowledge, learn more about this, because if I was going to have children here, I ended up having some children here, I didn't want them to grow up with the kind of opinions and attitudes that seemed the norm here about people of color. If they grew up with that, I was afraid that that would affect their self-esteem. So for me, it was both for my own sake, but also because since we were going to be living here, I couldn't let my kids grow up with these kinds of attitudes as defining attitudes for them. They needed to be. You
have used the word
prepared.
People of color.
Yes.
Can you tell me what do you mean by this word? Because we all have color. White is also, I mean, yes. Okay, white is not color in that, it's a reflection sometimes. But
I don't actually usually use the word people of color.
Yes.
I do think it's a complicated term. I usually say racially minoritized. But right. I thought since we're on TV, I'd try to be a little less academic. But the people of color seems to be the term many people are accepting for the time being. There's always a problem with terminology.
Exactly.
Because there's always against a whiteness, and whiteness is always becoming the norm in which we define all of these non-white positions, and in that sense you're always reinforcing whiteness as a norm. So language is a very important place to look at how can we do this where we create equality, or at least support equality through language. But I haven't found a neat term yet.
I try sometime to use the word non-white, then people start again dissecting, say, hey, there's no such thing called white, non-white. Anyway, you studied philosophy in USA,
yes.
You studied anthropology and literature in Aalborg University, but your research and books, they are about structural discrimination, or structural, I will say, racism. What is the connection in that?
Oh, that's complex.
Okay.
but
you can make
but
it
I can start with
as
philosophy is about ethics. It's about human interaction, about how are we in the world. Anthropology is about how we are in the world. Who are we? Who are the other people that we see and that we meet? How do we create ourselves and the others? There are sort of different ways of looking at humanity, philosophically, anthropologically, and in literary studies I found a very interesting theoretical approach that could help me put a lot of these issues about inequality in a context that was easier to understand why are these things being developed and reproduced through history. I studied something, I became very interested in post-colonial discourse theory, post-colonial theory, and particularly feminist discourse theory.
Relating to Denmark or just in general?
The whole world, very much in general, but
yes.
Also very much in Denmark. My interest was spurred by living in Denmark and being aware of how discrimination happens and how it often happens in a normalized way where we're not seeing that it's happening. We think that what we're doing is perfectly acceptable or normal or legitimate because we don't understand what the consequences of what we're saying might be or where these ideas even came from. We just assume that these truths are true. And some of these theoretical approaches, both from philosophy, anthropology, and from literature studies, literary theory studies, gave me some tools to try to put into words how these kinds of productions of each other, productions of knowledge occur. So for me, it was a way to work with this without making it altogether too personal, to try to figure out what's going on here.
Okay, before we go a little further and discuss various forms of discrimination, I have a simple question. Do we have racism in Denmark?
Yes.
Very
That's a quick
simple
answer.
question, simple
Of course
answer.
we do. Everybody in the world has racism. There's racism everywhere. In Denmark, we have very particular challenges in regard to how we have racism.
But then how come many Danes, intellectual, academic, politician, media, they always say we do not have racism in Denmark because we are colorblind?
Yes, that's true. They say that.
So are they right?
Personally, I would say from my research that they are going to have a tough time proving that. No, they're not right. I think they'd really like to be right. And I think one of the problems is that we have such a poor vocabulary and a poor knowledge of what racism is, what is discrimination, how are they expressed, what are the basic problems in this. Because we've had in Denmark a long history where we have created a narrative that in Denmark this doesn't happen. In Denmark we are equal. We have this sort of competing narrative of equality and just if we all put on our 2 cents, we'll all get the same out of it. And because that narrative is so strong, it's very hard to believe or acknowledge that there is also inequality or discrimination. As soon as there's someone being discriminated, it means somebody is privileged. It's very hard to acknowledge, and for some weird reason, Denmark is extremely blocked in this area. It's a very, very difficult area to talk about.
And it's also mono-ethnic.
It is not monoethnic, but that's true. There's a narrative of monoethnicity.
If you look at 95% people, this.
Yes, but if you look at that, if you were to deconstruct this notion of the monoethnicity, if you were to deconstruct this notion of the tribe, you would find that there is no tribe. There is no one race that is white in Denmark. It's absurd. There's been people coming from other countries for centuries here, from other regions of the world. It's part of this narrative of what is Denmark, this narrative of us being one person, or what do you call it, I don't even know what to call it. It's absurd. It's not true. There is a myth of monoethnicity.
When I speak with Danish politicians and also public discussion, they always say, but it's not a very big problem. Do they have a point that we don't have a big problem?
Well, I'm sure that the majority white male doesn't have much of a problem. So for him or her, or if it was a woman, most likely there isn't much of a problem in terms of racial discrimination, because often when you're in the privileged position, you're not going to feel the consequences in the same way that if you are in a minoritized position. But that doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means that you're in a position of power, so you can insist that your right is the right, or your truth is the truth for everybody.
Why this denial then?
I'm sorry?
Why this denial?
I think there are many reasons. That's complex.
Okay.
I think one of the reasons might be that it's really difficult to understand how it's happening. It's hard to see one's own complicity in it. I think there's guilt involved, and I also think it's a very complex area we don't know enough about. So it's just easier to say it's not there. Okay,
then let's cut the chase and say, as a researcher and academic, how would you define the word racism?
There you walk into a sort of a hornet's nest, because racism I define very differently from discrimination. When I talk about racism...
No, I'm talking about racism.
When I talk about racism, I'm looking at an ideological concept.
Okay.
This notion that we believe that people exist as races, that we actually believe there is something called biological race, or lacking that belief because by now we know there's no such thing as biological race. This is a myth again, it's been debunked. But many of our ways of thinking about each other in the world is still framed by how we see each other in races. Even though we may realize that we're not biologically racially different, we still think we see people's color and that becomes a characteristic for them. So that becomes the way racism is expressed today.
What about cultural racism then?
There's many ways of defining that.
Okay.
One way you could talk about that is by saying that now, instead of saying race, because we know racism is wrong, we know there's no biological race, we now define difference via the word culture. So we're using the word culture to replace the term race. And so we say, oh, it's because of their culture that they do this or they do that or they're in prison or so forth. But the fact is, what you're doing then is doing the same thing you were doing with race, but just connecting it to culture. It's also racial discrimination. It's also called neo-racism.
Okay, then let's come to that issue which you have done a lot of research about structural or institutional racism. How do you explain that? What is a structural racism?
You really want to know?
I want to know because you are the one person who can explain that.
I define structural discrimination differently than institutional discrimination.
Okay. All right.
Structural discrimination, when I work with it, is a more abstract notion. It means more what are the historical processes, the norms, the traditions, the way we have learned to think about ourselves in the world that then form the rules we make or the way in which we interact with other people. So I put structural discrimination kind of in an umbrella position as an umbrella term, and structural discrimination then informs many of the other types of discrimination that exist. So institutional discrimination, I know a lot of people put them together and conflate them, but in my work I separate them because institutional discrimination is a little easier to find in rules, in formalities, in regulations, in law.
You mean the state institution?
It's more formalized. It's more concrete because you can actually find rules and regulations or processes where discrimination, racial discrimination, and other discriminations are a result. So that's just defining difference is that you could almost say that structural discrimination is like normative, normalized. It's how we see the truths we see in the world, and the institutional is how we then act upon these or
can we say
regulate along these
simply
lines.
that structural racism is like a historical narrative, you know, and how our mindset works?
I like that. That's
okay.
good. That's much better.
Thank you.
That's good.
And institutional, how it is implemented, you know, in daily life.
In rules and regulations.
Exactly.
Because there's also micro-discrimination, meaning how we actually do to each other.
Then the question comes, does media also play any part in fermenting racism in the society?
Of course, media is just people. People have learned the same things everyone else have learned. They've been in the same schools. They speak the same language. It's, of course, they're going to reproduce the truths that they believe that they're
product of the society.
They're a product of the society. Of course, they're going to reproduce it. And also, Denmark, there's not much happening. This is the best game in town. If you want to get a little bit of a rise and get some media attention, play it up. I think there might be some winning going on here.
Okay. You recently wrote on your Facebook page that many Danish politicians in power say the same kind of thing as Donald Trump is saying, somehow, you know, and they spew the same kind of hatred.
Yes.
Can we compare these two phenomena?
I don't know that you could call it two phenomena. I think what Donald Trump is doing is basically giving voice to something that's being given voice to in a lot of parts of the world at the same time. He does it in a rather unique way, let's put it like that. And but what he's saying,
I would call it clumsy way.
Oh, I would like to use much different language, but we're on television. But what he's saying is very similar to what, I'm sorry, Dansk Folkeparti, even Venstre, many of our politicians that like to pretend they're in the middle. I wouldn't call Dansk Folkeparti in the middle. Danish People's Party, I guess you call it. But even our center-left politicians are speaking very much in similar terms. There is a general tendency to say remarkably bigoted and misinformed things, because it seems to be a way to be speaking to the fears of the people, and yet it seems to also be feeding the fears of the people. So it's kind of a terrible circle that's happening right now.
You talk about fear. Many ethnic minority, and especially with Muslim background, I speak to, they are very frightened with this rhetoric and this narrative which has been established in Danish society. And they're also afraid of the religious hatred they experience in the society. Are they justified in this fear?
Yes, of course they're justified. When people become the butt of, become scapegoats, when they become scapegoated in a society, that legitimizes treating them badly in society and legitimizes seeing them in that way. And as we've seen in history, this always escalates. Yes. We can hope it may not escalate at this time, but it doesn't look that way. It certainly looks like it's going in a direction we've seen before. So yes, they're justified, because they don't need to be killed on the streets to be met with so many difficulties in their everyday life, that they're justified in being frightened and saddened by that.
But is there any empirical proof for that, you know, or do we need an empirical survey?
We have a tendency in Denmark not to put money in research in this area, because perhaps because we still rest on this myth of it not being an issue in Denmark, or because we don't want to know. We've seen in Sweden there's been a lot of money put into some different structural discrimination research and different kinds of research on Islamophobia and so forth. We don't really do enough of that in Denmark. We barely do anything. So the only way you would be able to tell in a Danish context is to look at numbers and try to guess what is the logic between this number of people being stopped by the police and the how realistic is it that they really are so criminal as they're being. There are a lot of issues. I mean, that's too complicated to take on television, but we really need research in this area. We really need to support knowledge.
In May, there was a big conference in European Parliament which I took part, and there was a report, Islamophobia in Europe. All countries. The only country that was missing was Denmark. And I said to those two researchers from Austria, and I said, well, he said, we couldn't find any academic. So I said, you should have asked me, I would have given you some good names, you know. But it's amazing that somehow we are keeping ourselves saying there's nothing wrong, there's no need. Anyway.
It is.
And you talked about people of color. Do they also experience racism? For example, when I look at you, when I see your name, Mira and Thorsen, you know, and I have now, if I didn't see you, then say, oh, I mean, it's a Danish lady. And when I see you, do people of color also experience racism apart from others? Like
if you're thinking about Danish persons of color or
yes.
Danish racially minoritized, yes, of course they do. My research is actually only on highly educated, racially minoritized Danish youth, which means I only speak with young Danes, or younger than me at least. And yes, they all experience discrimination and racial discrimination. I haven't met anyone that hasn't experienced it. It comes in very different forms, and very often in a Danish context, it comes in what I would call a micro-discrimination form, meaning that it doesn't have to be, I hate you, spit on you on the street, which people do experience. Absolutely they do. And they receive all kinds of messages in school. So there's plenty of also very explicit discrimination. But the biggest problem seems to be, from the research I've looked at and the people I've been studying, and I haven't studied everybody, that micro-discrimination, little things, little positionings, small ways of making a person feel excluded, but in ways that are very hard to contest.
If I ask you an example, if I give you an example, then you can maybe tell me if it is racism. There's a person with color standing in the line in a bank, and Danish lady comes, a white Danish lady, and push him and say, go back, it's not your country. Would you call it racism? I
would definitely call it racial discrimination.
Okay.
And that would not be micro-discrimination.
No, okay.
That would be explicit racial discrimination.
Okay. Can then education help to eradicate or change this narrative we have?
Absolutely. But you have to be committed to it. We have to
You mean the state has to be committed to that?
The state, it always has to be top down. The politicians have to be committed. And media has to actually care enough to even, it could actually start with media. If the media just would try to educate themselves and give themselves a language around this problem of discrimination more broadly, a lot could happen. But we really need to have this integrated in schools like we've seen in other countries, have it brought into the way in which we're talking, bring it into the open, not have it as a taboo subject. To do that, we need knowledge, we need a vocabulary, we need language, ways in which to talk about this. And we really need to prioritize it if we're going to do anything in a Danish context.
You have two daughters, and they're also very involved in anti-discrimination.
They are.
Your one daughter, Tess, she spoke in front of the US Embassy about Black Lives Matter. Yeah. Is it your influence on them?
Well, I can't say that it isn't, but they are very interested themselves. They're also, they are very interested in these issues, and we've talked in our family as part of my way of making sure my kids didn't feel victimized or disempowered. We had very open conversations, and I've given my kids a vocabulary around this. And it's perfectly legitimate to talk about these things in our home. So they've learned a lot. They have a huge amount of knowledge. And so then they become a lot of people ask them, they get involved. Of course they get involved. So yes, there must be some
Danish politician wants to get out of human rights conventions. They say there's a need. Denmark can easily survive without that. Why should Denmark be, thinking about human rights convention?
Because if Denmark wants to, first of all, Denmark was very much part of creating these human rights conventions. We ratified them. We were very active in creating this. So the only reason we want to get out of it is because we're stepping over the bounds ourselves, and we're trying not to get ourselves into trouble. We're regretting it because we've become more right-wing, I guess. I don't know what it is. I don't study the whole society. You can say from the research that does exist, and from the kinds of commentary that there are, and from the whole movement in Europe, that there is a movement to right-wing, absolutely, no question. And Denmark is not lagging behind on that matter. We're very, very ahead of the game, partially, I think, motivated by the fact that we really believe we're not racist, so we think it's okay to say a lot of the things that are said from here.
Okay. All this research and work you do with racism, discrimination, I'm sure it leaves you angry. Sometimes you say, why in such a lovely country this thing happening? How do you relax? Is there anything you do that to calm you down?
Well, I don't really get angry, but I do get saddened, and I do find it frustrating. And I wonder how such a well-educated context can have such remarkably uneducated commentary about something where there's plenty of information available. So yeah, I do get frustrated. Sometimes I need to back down from this work, and I have some activities in my free time. That I have a hobby that's a very, very...
What is that?
I'm a horseback rider. I ride dressage.
Okay, yeah.
And so I ride dressage, and that's my little way of dealing with it. And it's That's my way.
But
it's a lovely place to go.
You
where
have to make time for that.
I have to make a lot of time for it. Yeah, but I have to do it.
In the end, we have discussed many serious issues, and I'm sure our viewers will be astonished, that there is situation in Denmark. Then the question comes, how do you see Denmark and Danish society, let's say in 15, 20, 30 years, vis-a-vis discrimination, Islamophobia, racism? Is it going to get better or is it going to get worse?
I wish I could read the future. I think Denmark could make a decision, frankly, to become incredibly good at not being racist and discriminatory. Denmark is such a good little country with a wonderful infrastructure, and a lot of people that really want to do the right thing in this country. A lot of people do. If we really wanted to, we could become front runners on anti-discrimination.
We were front runners many years
back. And we
back.
could easily do it again if we wanted to. There has to be a wish to do it. But this is one country where we actually could turn things around and become role models for someone else, but we have to make some pretty big work, do some big work to do it. But it's possible here. As one of the
My last question, as an academic and a researcher, but you're also involved in NGO work. You are part of ENAR. You are also, you founded one of the organizations called Broen, which is in English Brown. Yeah. Does NGO work can help to raise awareness among Danish society?
It definitely works. It is one of, you never can do just one thing. You need political interest, but you have to have the NGOs. You have to have people on the ground that are speaking up. You have to have people that are pushing the agenda. And that awareness creates more awareness. And yes, we need NGOs. And I wish Denmark would go back to the time where they actually supported more NGOs, because that could be a huge amount of work at a low price for them as well. But yes.
Well, these encouraging words, thank you very much, Mira. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank
and
you.
To my politician and journalist friends, please listen to such aware people so that you can understand that things can be changed for the better. And Denmark is a beautiful country, but we have to work hard to make it. Until next time, take good care of yourself.